More, of course, from that report from Malungelo Boy through the evening. With 5 general elections under our belt and another due next week, there seems to be little reason to be concerned around the future of democracy. But is this really the case? And is democracy the best options? Many South Africans say their hopes have not been fulfilled. Professor Daryl Glaser is at the Department of Political Studies at Wits University. Professor, good evening to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time. There's some people, I think, who really worry about our democracy. They worry we could become less democratic over time, that there'll be problems after the election next week, that the Electoral Commission will not be able to manage the elections. How do you assess the strength of our democracy?
Well, I'm not worried about the IEC at this point, although they do have a particularly complex process now with the 3-ballot system, so it's testing them in new ways. But the procedural functioning of our democracy, I'm relatively confident about. We've managed it well in the past, and I assume we will in the future. But, on the more substantive question, I suppose that we're about to find out how strong our democracy is probably the best answer to the question, in the twofold sense that, if the opinion polls are correct and the ANC falls below 50%, first of all, is it going to willingly cede power? This has been a question that's been hovering over South Africa's democracy for a very long time. And second of all, will we be able to form stable coalitions at the various levels of government where the ANC fails to secure a majority? So, people talk about every election being particularly important and momentous, but just because the ANC is about to fall below 50%, I think this one really is momentous, and it's going to be a giant test.
Do you think our election will be free and fair? So from what we can see, parties seem to have been able to campaign freely in most places. I can't think of sort of consistent no-go zones. I mean, there'll be 1 or 2 places of difficulty, but there haven't been no-go zones in the sense that we saw in the 1990s. Do you think people will be able to vote freely as well?
I assume so at this stage. I mean, I've heard the odd suggestion of no-go zones. There probably always have been, and for a long while to come will be, localized no-go zones. But on the whole, there's an independent media. The public broadcaster is a lot better than a lot of public broadcasters in terms of its objectivity, despite complaints. So I think, South Africans, especially urban South Africans, where the ANC faces its greatest challenge, have got lots of sources of information. And, I would say the fact that Zuma was not allowed to stand as a candidate for parliament was itself a bit of a testing moment, but we seem so far to have passed the test. I mean, Zuma seems to, and his cohort seem to be satisfied with the fact that, he can still be on the ballot and he can still be a behind-the-scenes leader of the party. So we haven't been treated to a fresh spate of unrest coming out of Gauteng. I mean, there are worries about whether there might be trucker strikes. There are always risks in South Africa. But at this stage, I'm reasonably optimistic. And, certainly when we compare the circumstances under which this election is being held compared to the very precarious circumstances of the 1994 election, I think we're on much safer ground this time.
You talk about coalition governments, and I mean, never mind national government, but certainly it would seem in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng we'll have coalition governments. I don't know what's going to happen with Umkhonto weSizwe in KwaZulu-Natal, but I can't, on the face of it, see the ANC wanting to work with them. Are we going to have quite difficult coalition governments, do you think?
I think that it's going to be tricky because, you tend to see this in elections, but it's a problem when you've got a proportional representation system when parties are falling below 50%. So you pretty much know they're going to be coalitions. So I think it would be better if parties are more straightforward with the voters about potential coalition partners, rather than absolutely vilifying other parties now, and then just suddenly turning around to the voters and saying, oh, well, we've decided to, whatever it may be, say, rescue South Africa by forming a coalition with this party we previously sort of spent much time beating up on. So I think it's going to be difficult. I think the only way I can see it being stable, frankly, is if the ANC is the anchor of a coalition. Now, of course, a lot of parties don't want to be associated with the ANC's record of failure. But simply because the ANC is going to be, in this election and probably for a fair number of elections to come, the largest party, it has to be the anchor of a stable coalition. And the ANC has the option of forming coalitions either to the sort of centrist right of itself or to the sort of African or black nationalist left of itself. It would have the semblance of a kind of centrist coherence or broad center coherence, whereas perhaps leaning either left or right. Whereas, if you had a coalition of the MK with DA or EFF with DA, that would be a completely ideologically incoherent coalition. And even if they managed to put together enough parties to get over the 50% mark, I just think that wouldn't last very long and it would not be very democratically healthy. So, look, I mean, we know from the record of countries like Germany and many other countries that have PR, proportional representation, that coalitions can function very well and they can help to unify countries at their best. But our record in local government makes us worry.
And Professor, very quickly, the culture of democracy in South Africa. Do you think our democracy will still be strong, sustainable in 2029, 5 years from now?
I think there are some big question marks beyond the test that this election itself is going to provide. And I think the biggest test is going to come from the impatience of a younger generation that's disillusioned with the constitutional settlement of the mid-1990s, which takes the view that basically democracy hasn't delivered and that perhaps even it's a Western imposition. This is certainly the line that's coming out of the MK party, and I think it has some resonance. Unfortunately, democracy is primarily a procedure for making collective decisions, and people have loaded huge expectations on it. In fact, how well the government performs or not is largely contingent on whether we elect good leaders or bad leaders, not on the facts of democracy itself. Yes, I think that there is a discontent, and it's something that has to be watched very closely, and it has to be addressed if we want our democratic culture to further entrench itself and still be around in 20 years.
Professor Daryl Glaser, thank you. In the Department of Political Studies at Wits University, do appreciate the time on the ballot brief tonight.